Well, you're on Morning Live. Thanks so much for staying with us this morning. Statistics South Africa reported yesterday that the country's gross domestic product, or GDP, regressed by 2% in the first 3 months of 2020, keeping us in a recession. Now, this bleak picture comes on the back of Finance Minister Tito Mboweni's supplementary budget speech last week, where the Finance Minister stated that Treasury expected GDP to decline by 7.2% in the 2020 fiscal year. So joining us now is Dawie Roodt, Chief Economist at the Efficient Group, to talk about this 2% regression in GDP. Dawie, good morning. Always good to speak to you. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning to you, and thank you very much.
So let's start with your thoughts, your view on the 2% regression in GDP in the first 3 months of 2020.
Yeah, I think what is important for all of us to understand, firstly, is that the South African economy was already in a recession. The last 2 quarters of last year, the economy contracted. And in fact, if you stand back a little bit, you will find that on a average per capita basis, the average South African has been getting poorer for the past 5 years already. A second point that is very important is that, yes, of course, the virus is impacting on the South African economy, but this was only the beginning of the virus period, the first quarter. Only the last month of the first quarter was affected by the current lockdown. And I think the second quarter is going to be absolutely horrible. And maybe the last point that I think is important to make as well is that I just had a look at South Africa's per capita GDP, and I adjusted that to see what South Africa's per capita GDP will be after this year's expected very, very weak economic growth. Then at the end of this year, the average South African will be where we were last in 1981. So that's the extent of the financial crisis, or extent of the economic crisis in which we find ourselves at the moment. Don't blame the virus. We have been in very deep trouble already before this, and I'm afraid things are probably going to get even worse over the next couple of quarters.
So, Dawie, against the backdrop that you've just sketched for us, and given how the virus and this COVID-19 pandemic has actually exacerbated an already dire financial situation, what are our prospects of recovery in the short to medium term?
Yeah, the question about recovery is a difficult question, because if the question is what's it like in terms of economic growth? In other words, do I think the economy is going to start growing sometime? Yes, it certainly is going to start growing probably by the end of this year. Unfortunately, the way that economic growth is calculated, we measure economic activity from one period to the next. So if you have a very, very weak period, and then chances are pretty good that you're going to see a better quarter thereafter. So we should see some economic growth by the end of this year, but very weak levels of economic growth. But bringing us back to where we were only 5 years ago will require many years of very strong economic growth. So if the question is, when are we going to be back where we were 5 years ago, it's probably going to take us the best part of 10 years. It's going to take us a very, very long time. And I'm afraid to say is that looking at current policies, looking at the confidence in the South African economy, I'm not so sure that we are going to see sustainable growth over the next couple of quarters. And maybe what one should add as well, the Minister of Finance did deliver his medium-term, or rather his emergency budget last week. And what is required from the state is to cut back on state spending in order to stabilize the fiscal debt situation. And when they do that, that will also weigh on economic growth. So it seems to me there's absolutely no way out in the short term, and that we will see a continuation of this extremely weak levels of economic growth and everything bad that goes with it.
So talking about, cutting back on state expenditure, where do we start? Because, on the one hand, you're sitting with a situation whereby we've literally come to a standstill, and it's not just us, it's the world at large. So where do we start? Where do we start trimming the fat first?
Well, we should have done this a long time ago. In fact, analysts and economists have been warning government that we are on a totally unsustainable trajectory. Now we've got the virus on top of everything. And again, I must emphasize this, we were in a crisis before the crisis. Where do we start? It's inevitable. We have to cut back on state spending, especially in current expenditure. And that means things like, for example, the wage bill must be reduced. Spending on state-owned enterprises must be reduced. But more importantly, and perhaps most importantly, we have to get clarity, a political clarity. There's so much uncertainty on who really is in charge of government. There's so much uncertainty on what real policies are. Because, for example, is South African Airways going to fly or isn't it going to fly? So we have to get clarity and certainty on policy and political leadership before we can actually start fixing the economy. I'm afraid political leadership, I guess, is perhaps more of an issue at the moment than the economy.
So, Dawie, who is in charge of the South African economy?
Can you please say that again?
Who is in charge of the South African economy?
Well, who's in charge of the South African? The single biggest South African economy, of course, is the state, is government. The state is roughly about 30% of the South African economy. If you include the state-owned enterprises and the local authorities, then we're talking about 40% or more of the South African economy consists of what we call the state or state-related activities. So without a doubt, the state is by far the single biggest player in the South African economy, and it's got a huge impact on the economy. The rest of the economy, of course, consists of the private sector. And the private sector at the moment is not investing because they don't have confidence in government. And the private sector is being decimated currently by things like, for example, the lockdown, but also previously by things like, for example, a lack of electricity and exceptionally high tax burden and very inefficient state. So, yes, I guess there are more than one player in the economy, but I have very little doubt in saying that if we want to blame somebody for the problems that we are currently experiencing, it must be government for the wrong policies and the inefficiency of the state, generally speaking.
As you say, these are long-standing issues because it's been a while since we've had this discussion about the private sector not investing in the South African economy. But just looking at those stats from yesterday, Dawie, the largest negative contributors to that 2% GDP regression were manufacturing. They declined by 8.5% as an industry, and mining 21.5%. And one has to ask, beyond the obvious problem of the coronavirus, why are these industries, not performing optimally, and can they not be separated, as it were?
Yeah, maybe just a comment about investments. In fact, investments is another big negative. It was a contraction of 20% on investments. And I know people are saying that the private sector is on an investment strike. That is, in fact, not true. The private sector invests far more than the state. And I've calculated that the state will destroy approximately 500 billion rands of savings this year. That's the saving of the state. Talking about those two sectors that you've referred to, you're absolutely correct. We need especially those kind of sectors to grow. Now, that is typically in the primary and the secondary sector. Those kind of sectors is where we can potentially employ a lot of people. But those are the sectors that are really, really struggling, especially mining and manufacturing. I guess there could be many reasons for that. One obvious reason has to do with the lack of electricity, but there are many, many other reasons as well. For example, I would say that the labor legislation is a contributing reason, especially in mining. There's a lot of policy uncertainty in mining. And of course, there are some other issues that we need to address as well. But those two sectors are crucial if we want to do something about unemployment. Unemployment, as we know, is already standing at very, very high levels, and we're probably going to lose another 2 million people in terms of unemployment, or 2 million jobs this year, bringing the unemployment levels at the end of this year probably close to about 12 million people without jobs in the expanded definition. But we need to get those sectors growing. And unfortunately, when you look especially at manufacturing, the South African economy has been deindustrializing for many years now. And the contribution of manufacturing to the South African economy has been falling and falling and falling, like most other countries in the world. But it's particularly important for South Africa because of our high levels of unemployment.
Dawie, just before I let you go into news time, what does all of this mean? And how does it ultimately affect the pockets of ordinary South Africans?
Well, what it all means, it's not just a number. It really affects all. I expect the South African economy to contract this year in total, for the year in total 2020, by approximately 10%. There are various numbers, but 10% is more or less in the ballpark for most analysts. In the meantime, the population is growing around about 1.5%, say 2% or so, which means that the average South African will be poorer this year, on average more than 10%, around about 15%. So that's the extent of the troubles in which we are in at the moment. So I think why this is important to all of us, because many people are losing their jobs, poverty will increase, and it is because the economy is not growing. If there's one single number, that's the most important single number out there, it must be economic growth. And I think we will have to put all policies and everything aside and only concentrate in one thing, and that's to get this economy growing. Because only through economic growth can we get all those things that we think are important to.
Well, Dawie Roodt, thanks for your time this morning. Dawie Roodt is the chief economist at the Efficient Group, talking to us about those figures released yesterday by Stats SA, where 2%, we saw 2% GDP regression, and also looking at other economic factors. That brings us to time for news here.